What happens when one of Hollywood's most commanding stars clashes with one of daytime TV's sharpest voices on live television? The moment was electric, and no one in the studio, or watching at home, could believe what unfolded. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe to Prime Narrator and tap the like button right now. Comment as you watch to let us know whose side you're on, because you won't want to miss a second of this drama. The studio lights of The View glared brighter than usual that morning. There was a buzz among the crew backstage. Everyone knew this episode was different. Charlize Theron, known for her icy elegance and fearless roles, was there to promote her new film. She walked on set with the poise of a queen, tall, confident, and smiling faintly as the audience erupted in applause. But there was a tension beneath her composure, the kind only a few sharp eyes could notice. Sunny Hostin, sitting to the left of the panel, had been unusually quiet during the introductions. Her pen tapped lightly on her cue cards as if drumming up the courage, or perhaps sharpening the edge, for what she was about to say. The cameras zoomed in on both women, catching the subtle flicker of Charlize's smirk and the steel in Sunny's gaze. The first few minutes of the interview were calm enough, even charming. Whoopi Goldberg tossed in her trademark humor, trying to keep the energy light. The audience laughed. Charlize answered questions about her new role with smooth professionalism. But then Sunny leaned forward, her voice soft yet carrying a weight that hushed the air. "Charlize," she began, tilting her head slightly, "in your recent interview with Vanity Fair, you mentioned that you sometimes feel frustrated with how certain talk shows handle political discussions. I have to ask, were you referring to shows like ours?" The question hung like a blade in midair. The audience shifted, a few audible gasps mixing with the murmurs. Charlize's smile faded, just enough to be noticed. She took a slow breath before answering. "I wasn't pointing fingers at anyone in particular," she said carefully, but her eyes were locked on Sunny's. "I just think sometimes conversations about real issues get lost in noise." Sunny's eyebrow arched, her pen no longer tapping. "Noise," she repeated, letting the word echo. "Are you suggesting that what we do here, bringing attention to political and social matters, is noise?" The audience leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The air was heavy, charged. Whoopi shifted in her chair, ready to jump in, but something about the electricity between Charlize and Sunny held her back for the moment. Charlize's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm saying that sometimes the back and forth can drown out the facts. And frankly, when I see a panel shout over each other instead of listening, it doesn't always move the conversation forward." That was the first spark. Sunny's lips curved into a sharp, restrained smile. "Interesting," she said, her tone calm but laced with something sharper. "Because some might say it's celebrities coming onto shows like ours, talking about politics between promoting their movies, that distracts from the facts." The crowd erupted with scattered cheers and a few gasps. A cameraman instinctively zoomed in on Charlize's face. She didn't flinch, but there was a flash in her eyes, a flicker of heat. Her voice, when it came, was quieter but more intense. "Sunny," she said, leaning forward just slightly, "I've spent decades using my platform to talk about human rights, about real crises in the world. I don't come here to distract. I come here because I care." Sunny held her ground, her voice now firm. "And I respect that. But you can't come on this show and dismiss the way we do our work. You don't get to decide which conversations are worth having." The tension snapped like a live wire. Whoopi finally stepped in, her tone half joking but with a warning edge. Okay, ladies, let's keep it civilized. We're all on the same team here. At least I think we are." The audience laughed nervously, but the undercurrent of conflict didn't fade. Charlize straightened in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. Her poise returned, but there was a glint in her eyes that suggested this wasn't over. Sunny, meanwhile, glanced at her notes again, as though already preparing her next strike. The cameras caught every twitch, every glance, every breath. Behind the scenes, the producers exchanged quick looks, silently debating whether to cut to a commercial early. But this was gold, tense, raw, unplanned gold. As the conversation moved to Charlize's new film, The politeness returned for a moment. She talked about the challenges of portraying her character, the intense preparation, the emotional toll. The audience clapped at the right moments, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud refusing to move on. Then, as if unable to resist, Sunny steered the topic back. "You play a character who stands up against a corrupt system," she said. "Do you think Hollywood celebrities sometimes create their own system? One where they get to speak over everyone else without being challenged?" The room went still. It was the kind of question that felt less like a question and more like a challenge thrown across a line. Charlize's eyes narrowed, and she let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "I think it's ironic," she replied slowly, "that you accuse actors of speaking over others while sitting on a platform where you do it every day." The audience gasped loudly this time. A few scattered claps came from one corner. The energy shifted from tension to outright confrontation. Sunny's face remained calm, but her eyes flashed. "We invite people here to speak. We don't come into their world and tell them how to act." The exchange was sharp, almost surgical in its precision. Each word felt like it was being thrown with intent. And as the commercial break loomed, the cameras caught Charlize sitting back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line, and Sunny staring down at her notes, though clearly not reading them. In that moment, the audience knew this was only the beginning. What had started as a standard promotional interview had ignited into something far more explosive, something that would soon spill out of the studio and into the headlines. When the cameras returned from the commercial break, the tension in the studio hadn't cooled. If anything, it had thickened, like a storm that had merely paused its thunder. The applause that greeted the panel sounded polite, but there was a restless energy in the audience. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something that could unravel at any second. Charlize adjusted her posture in the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression poised but unmistakably guarded. The air around her seemed to hum with quiet defiance. Sunny, on the other hand, appeared composed, her pen poised above her cue cards as though waiting to etch the next decisive line in this very public sparring match. Whoopi leaned forward, her smile a little tighter than before. "All right," she said with a breezy tone that didn't quite mask the tension beneath. "Let's all take a breath and maybe talk about the movie. Our viewers are dying to know what drew you to this role, Charlize." Charlize gave a gracious nod. "It's a story about standing up when it's not convenient to do so," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, but her eyes still carried the sharpness of a blade. "About speaking the truth even when the world doesn't want to hear it." There was polite applause from the audience, but Sunny didn't clap. She tilted her head, the corners of her lips curling ever so slightly. "That's admirable," she said, her tone level. "But some might say that speaking the truth doesn't always mean interrupting others or dismissing how they do their jobs." The words landed like pebbles in still water, rippling outward. A few audience members exchanged glances. The tension was back, thicker, heavier, impossible to ignore. Charlize let out a slow breath, her smile polite but icy. "I don't think being honest is ever dismissive," she replied. "But I do think that when conversations become more about winning arguments than understanding each other, we all lose." Sunny leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking on Charlize. "Or," she countered, "maybe it's about holding powerful voices, actors, politicians, even journalists, accountable for what they say. That's not noise. That's our job." The silence that followed was electric. The audience was completely still, leaning in as if afraid to miss even a single syllable. Whoopi stepped in again, raising a hand as if to part the invisible tension between them. Hey, listen," she said, her voice a mix of exasperation and humor. "We're here to talk, not to duel. Let's try to remember that." The attempt at levity earned a scattered chuckle from the audience, but it didn't soften the locked gazes between Charlize and Sunny. Then Joy Behar chimed in, her tone light but probing. "Charlize, do you feel like shows like ours sometimes put you in the hot seat more than you'd like?" Charlize gave a small, amused laugh, though there was little amusement in her eyes. "No," she said. "I'm fine being challenged. But I came here to have a conversation, not to be cornered." There's a difference. Sunny's smile thinned. Sometimes the difference depends on how willing someone is to hear a perspective that isn't their own. The air shifted again. Audible gasps rippled through the audience. A few clapped, others murmured. The tension wasn't just between the two women anymore. It was in the room itself, like a live wire strung between every person present. Charlize's expression hardened. She sat forward in her chair, no longer hiding the edge in her tone. "I've faced far tougher questions than yours," she said, her voice low and steady. "But don't mistake being direct for being dismissive. I respect conversation. I don't respect condescension." The words hung in the air like a dare. Sunny didn't flinch. Her chin lifted slightly as she replied, "Respect goes both ways." It was the kind of exchange that wasn't loud or theatrical, but somehow felt more dangerous because of the restraint. Neither raised their voice, but each sentence felt sharpened to a fine point, aimed with precision. The audience, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the two women. One fan in the front row later described the feeling as watching a chess match with live grenades. The producers backstage were on edge. The director spoke through the earpieces to the camera crew. "Stay wide, don't cut away. This is the moment." Back on set, Whoopi let out a sigh that was half a laugh. "All right, let's pivot for a second," she said, glancing at the cue cards. "Charlize, you've been an outspoken advocate for women's rights. How do you think Hollywood has changed in addressing those issues?" Charlize relaxed slightly, as if grateful for a reprieve. Her voice softened as she spoke passionately about the progress made in recent years, about the battles still to fight. The audience nodded and clapped, the atmosphere briefly calmer. But the calm didn't last. Sunny, waiting for her moment, cut in as soon as the applause died down. "You talk about progress," she said, her voice level but edged with skepticism. "Yet you've criticized media platforms like ours for being too combative. Isn't confrontation sometimes necessary to push for change?" Charlize turned to her fully, no longer bothering with a polite smile. "Confrontation can be necessary," she said, "but it doesn't have to be hostile. And it doesn't have to become about scoring points instead of finding solutions." Sunny's reply was immediate, her tone controlled but sharp. "But sometimes it takes pushing back, really pushing, to get answers from people who'd rather dodge the tough questions." The audience reacted again, a low murmur spreading through the rows. Whoopi shook her head slightly, muttering, "Lord, give me strength," earning a ripple of laughter that quickly faded as the tension returned. Charlize leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And sometimes," she said, "people push not to get answers, but to make themselves look like they're winning." The remark hit like a spark in dry grass. A few audience members gasped aloud. Others whispered to each other. Sunny's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm composure holding, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed her irritation. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, more intense than any shouting match could have been. The cameras captured Charlize's steady gaze, Sunny's controlled stillness, and the charged stillness of the panel. Finally, Whoopi cleared her throat. "All right," she said, her tone almost pleading. "We're going to take another quick break before we all need therapy." The audience laughed, grateful for the brief release, but as the cameras cut to commercial, the tension didn't dissipate. It sat there, heavy and unspoken, promising that the next segment would be even more explosive. Backstage, crew members exchanged wide-eyed looks. One stagehand whispered to another, "I've never seen Charlize this fired up." What none of them realized yet was that the worst, or perhaps the best, for the headlines, was still to come. The final act of this clash hadn't even begun. The lights came back on for the next segment, but the energy in the studio had shifted entirely. The audience's applause at the return from the break sounded thinner, more tentative, like they sensed they were witnessing something that could break apart at any moment. Even the panelists' smiles were strained, as if pasted on for the cameras. Charlize sat a little further forward in her chair now, her shoulders squared, her expression that of a woman bracing for impact. Sunny, still composed, shuffled her cue cards with deliberate calm, a small smile flickering on her lips. Whoopi looked between them like a referee who had lost control of the game. The host tried to steer the conversation back to lighter territory. "Charlize," she said, her voice a little too bright. "You've played some really powerful characters, warriors, revolutionaries. I have to ask, do you see yourself as someone who thrives in conflict?" Charlize let out a small laugh, though it sounded more like a release of tension than genuine amusement. "I thrive on truth," she said. "Conflict just seems to show up when the truth isn't convenient." The audience responded with a scattered murmur of approval. Sunny's pen stilled on her lap. She looked up slowly, meeting Charlize's gaze. "Speaking of truth," Sunny said evenly, "I have to bring this up. Last month you were quoted saying you sometimes avoid certain daytime talk shows because, in your words, they care more about spectacle than substance. Did you mean this show?" The words dropped into the air like a stone plunging into deep water. The studio fell so silent that the faint hum of the lights could be heard. Every camera swung toward Charlize. A few audience members held their breath. Charlize's eyes flashed, but she didn't look away. "I didn't name names," she said. "But if you think your show fits that description, maybe you should ask yourself why." The gasp that rolled through the crowd was sharp and audible, like a wave hitting the shore. Someone in the front row muttered, "Oh my God," and clasped their hands over their mouth. Sunny didn't blink. She leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping lower, steadier. "We ask hard questions because that's what our viewers expect. If you don't like that, maybe you should stick to movie premieres." The line landed like a punch. A ripple of murmurs went through the audience. A few clapped, but most just stared, caught in the tension of the moment. Charlize inhaled through her nose, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. When she spoke, her voice was cool, precise, and carried across the entire studio. "I've sat across from world leaders and journalists far tougher than you. I don't mind hard questions. But there's a difference between a tough question and a loaded one designed to provoke a fight." Sunny's lips curved into a faint, razor-thin smile. "Sometimes it's the only way to cut through polished talking points." Whoopi let out a nervous laugh. "Ladies, remember, this isn't a courtroom." But the clash had already taken on a momentum of its own. Charlize turned fully toward Sunny now, no longer performing for the camera. Her voice was firm, resonant with controlled anger. "You invited me here to talk about my film, about the causes I care about," she said. "Instead, you've spent the whole time questioning my motives. I came in good faith to have a conversation. I didn't come here to be interrogated like a defendant." A murmur swept across the audience. The cameraman zoomed in on Charlize's face, her jaw set, her eyes steady but blazing. Sunny didn't back down. "If you believe in your positions, you shouldn't be afraid to defend them, especially on live television." Charlize stood up. The movement was slow but deliberate, and it sucked the air out of the studio. The audience gasped as she rose to her full height, her hands at her sides, her expression no longer polite. "I'm not afraid," Charlize said, her voice lower now, sharper. "I'm just not willing to keep playing this game." The producers backstage scrambled, unsure whether to cut to commercial. The director's voice came through the headsets. "Stay with it. This is history." Sunny straightened in her chair, her eyes fixed on Charlize. "Walking out won't change the questions people have," she said, her voice cool but tight. Charlize shook her head slightly. "Maybe not. But I don't have to stay in a conversation that's more about spectacle than substance." The audience erupted, some clapping, some gasping, some shouting, "No, don't go." Whoopi raised both hands, her voice rising. Okay, Charlize, hold on, we can talk this out." But Charlize had already stepped away from her chair. She walked across the stage with the long, purposeful strides of someone who had made up her mind. Her heels clicked sharply against the studio floor, each step echoing in the stunned silence. The cameras followed her as she exited stage left, the applause sign forgotten, the audience caught between cheers, gasps, and a few scattered boos. Sunny stayed seated, her face unreadable but her fingers gripping her cue cards tightly. Whoopi exhaled audibly, muttering something under her breath that the mic didn't catch. Joy Behar finally broke the silence, leaning slightly toward Sunny. "Well," she said in her wry, trademark tone, "that went well." The audience laughed nervously, but the sound didn't break the tension that still lingered in the studio. For a long, loaded moment, the camera captured the empty chair where Charlize had been sitting. It was as if the absence itself had become the star of the show. Whoopi turned to the audience, her voice half apologetic, half teasing. "You never know what's going to happen live on The View, folks. We'll be right back." The screen faded to commercial, but the studio buzzed with whispers. Crew members exchanging looks, audience members craning their necks toward the wings where Charlize had vanished. The clash had reached its peak, but the story was far from over. The real storm was just beginning, and it was about to rage far beyond the walls of the studio. The commercial break stretched on longer than usual. In the studio, the audience sat in hushed clusters, murmuring as if they'd witnessed an earthquake. Some craned their necks toward the side of the stage, hoping to catch even the briefest glimpse of Charlize. Others whispered in disbelief, replaying the moment she stood up and left. When the show returned live, the panel's energy was different. Sunny sat upright, hands folded on her lap, her expression calm but unreadable. Whoopi leaned forward as if to take control of the moment. Joy kept glancing toward the empty chair. "Folks," Whoopi said, her voice softer than usual, "live television can get intense. We hope Charlize is okay, and we want to thank her for being here, even if things got a little heated." The audience offered a light, uncertain round of applause. It sounded more like a sigh than a cheer. Sunny's lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at her hands. Joy finally broke the tension, her tone dry but sympathetic. "You know, this isn't the first time someone's walked off this show. Probably won't be the last. But you hate to see it happen." Sunny spoke next, her voice steady but tinged with something heavier. "Sometimes real conversations are uncomfortable. That's the price of honesty." The words drew a soft murmur from the crowd. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. There was no mistaking the fact that the panel was shaken. Outside the studio, the story was already moving at the speed of wildfire. By the time the episode ended, clips of the walk-off were flooding social media. A shaky cell phone video from an audience member, showing Charlize striding off stage with her head high, went viral within minutes. On Twitter, hashtags like #Charlize vs. Sunny and #ViewWalkOff shot to the top of the trending list. Some fans sided with Charlize, praising her for standing up against what they saw as unfair treatment. One user tweeted, "Sunny went too far. You don't invite a guest to attack them." Another wrote, "Charlize was dodging real questions. Sunny did her job." Instagram Reels replayed the moment of silence before Charlize stood up, over and over, with captions like, "You could hear the tension crack, and that was the sound of a breaking point." Late-night talk show hosts couldn't resist the drama either. That very night, one quipped, "Forget movie premieres. Charlize just delivered the performance of the year," by walking out. The audience roared with laughter, but behind the humor was a genuine fascination. The next morning, news outlets plastered screenshots of the moment across their front pages. Headlines screamed, "Charlize Theron storms off live show after clash with host." Sunny Hostin stands her ground in fiery on-air confrontation. Reporters camped outside the studio, hoping to catch a comment from either star. When asked by paparazzi as she left her hotel, Charlize only offered a brief statement. "I stand by everything I said. Sometimes the best way to be heard is to walk away." Sunny, for her part, addressed the incident the following day on the show. "I respect Charlize's work," she said, her tone even. "But when you come to a platform like ours, you have to be ready for tough questions. That's what our audience deserves." The fallout wasn't just media spectacle. It sparked larger conversations online about the role of talk shows, the treatment of celebrity guests, and how much conflict audiences really want on live television. Back at The View, producers reportedly held a closed-door meeting about the incident. Some insiders hinted that they might rethink how interviews with high-profile guests are handled. Others felt the controversy only boosted ratings. For viewers, though, it wasn't just another headline. It felt like they had witnessed a cultural flashpoint. Two powerful women colliding in front of millions, exposing not just personal tension, but a deeper divide about media, celebrity, and accountability. By the end of the week, memes of the empty chair Charlize had left behind were everywhere. Someone even created a parody Twitter account called Charlize's Chair, posting quips like, "I didn't expect to be the main guest today." But behind the humor, the moment lingered. Viewers replayed the video not just for the drama, but for the emotions it evoked. The flash of anger in Charlize's eyes, the steady determination in Sunny's voice, the collective gasp of an audience realizing they were witnessing something unforgettable. As the dust began to settle, one thing became clear. The clash wasn't just a fleeting viral moment. It had become a symbol of the friction between celebrities seeking space to speak and media platforms determined to challenge them. And that's where you come in. What do you think? Was Charlize right to walk away? Or was Sunny doing her job by asking the hard questions? Comment below and let us know whose side you're on. If you were hooked by this story, if you felt the tension in that studio, the weight of that silence before Charlize stood up, make sure you subscribe to Prime Narrator right now. Hit the like button and share this video so more people can join the conversation about this unforgettable showdown. Because if this clash proved anything, it's that live television still has the power to shock, to divide, and to keep us all talking long after the cameras stop rolling.